Hi everyone, this is a support session for Assessment 1 on MD6028. So Assessment 1 is the case study, and what I'm going to do in this session is just give you some advice about the case study. I'm going to walk through the key sections that should be present and just make sure you have the information that you need to understand what you have to do, basically. So for many of you, a case study will be a new type of assessment, so it's likely that you won't have written a case study before, and that's fine, that's expected. I create this assessment because I want to, challenge you and assess you in a new way, and that's what, again, we're hopefully doing with this case study. One of the implications of that, however, is I want to be crystal clear on exactly what sections should be included. So in terms of the specific sections that are there, it's going to be different to anything you've submitted before. So this slide is here to clearly demonstrate exactly what should be present. So there should be an abstract. There should then be a background or an introduction, same thing really, just something that provides background information and that introduces the reader to the topic. Next, there is a timeline of events. Now, the timeline of events, this is something you definitely won't have done before. So you'll see many of these sections are fairly familiar. So in most scientific submissions, you'll have something like this. You'll have an abstract, and then you'll have a background and an introduction, right? And then towards the end, you'll have the discussion and then the conclusion. This is what a scientific submission tends to look like. However, this timeline of events, again, this is new, this is different. Now, the case study itself should be focused on a outbreak of a viral disease. Okay, so we're picking a specific outbreak of a viral disease, and for you to effectively explain this outbreak, you need to have a timeline of events. So you need to say exactly what has happened and say it in chronological order. And usually this will start with the first cases, and then it will progress through. It will include statistics on case numbers including usually, and it will include key events. So key events will be, maybe quarantine being enacted, maybe a new therapeutic intervention being approved, maybe a new government measure to try to combat the spread of the infectious disease. Again, these are all key events that are relevant to the particular outbreak that you've chosen, and so they need to be included on this timeline of events. Now, this timeline of events, it can be presented just like a normal figure, so it should be a literal timeline. So it should have arrows, it should have boxes, it should have a clear sense of progression, and this sense of progression again should be chronological. So you're starting at a particular date, and then you're progressing through the key events until you arrive at the end point, and the end point could be when the viral outbreak is under control, or if it's ongoing, you could just make a point that the events are ongoing and just end the timeline at a reasonable point. So again, really important that this is included, really important we understand what it is, really important it's referenced thoroughly, just like any figure should be. Really important that it has a legend and it has an explanation. If you want examples of timeline of events, you can look at case studies online. I'd encourage you to do this. Yeah, so obviously all of these different sections are really, really important. I'm going to talk about all of them, but the timeline of events, I wanted to give it a bit of extra attention at the start because it's something new, because it's something you probably haven't done before. It's nothing particularly scary once you understand what it is. And again, what it is a figure that demonstrates graphically the progression of a particular viral outbreak over time. Okay, so let's now move back to the start and think about the background and introduction. So obviously you have your abstract initially, but the abstract is actually the thing you write last, and all an abstract needs to be is an effective summary of the paper overall. The background and introduction now. So when we're thinking about what to include in the background and introduction, students are often faced with the issue of either worrying they're including too much or worrying they're not including enough, and often these worries are real. Sometimes you get a submission where the background is way too in-depth, and it actually dominates the submission to the point where there's not a substantial discussion because all the word count was essentially used up in the background. On the other hand, sometimes there's submissions where the background is really minimal to the point where it doesn't effectively support the paper as a whole, so it doesn't effectively introduce the key topics. Generally, to avoid going to either of these extremes, we advise students to ensure that the background provides a satisfactory introduction to the key topics. By that we mean everything that is necessary for the reader to understand the submission as a whole is explained in the background. So key concepts are explained, key background information is explained. So someone could come to your submission having very little background information themselves about the viral outbreak, but once they read the background information you provide, that background is sufficient for them to understand your timeline of events and for them to understand your discussion. So obviously, if we're looking at our background and we have masses of really technical information that actually isn't utilized in the discussion, so it's not necessary to understand this technical information to understand the discussion, then that information is probably overboard. However, on the other hand, if we're explaining in the discussion specific concepts and we're exploring these concepts and evaluating them, but these concepts aren't explained in the background. So for example, if in the discussion we're talking about therapeutic interventions that target particular stages of the viral life cycle, but we don't have the viral life cycle explained in the background, then this is a problem the other way. This means the background probably isn't sufficient. So that's something we can really think about as we're putting the background together. Something else we can think about is the inclusion of figures. So it's a specific point, but it's a really important one because you do need to include figures in your introduction. Again, when I'm saying background and introduction, I'm meaning exactly the same thing. Again, you'll be explaining some really quite complex topics in your background, and one way you can explain topics quite effectively is to put them as a figure. So a figure can be a really effective way to demonstrate a concept, as long as it is an effective figure, so it's clear, it's well referenced, it's well made, and it has a clear legend and things like that. So please do use figures in the background. Something else the background should be doing is providing context. Okay, so the viral outbreak you're talking about will have information directly relevant to the viral outbreak that the reader needs to understand. And this is again part of what should be included in the background, but there should also be wider information. So you need to talk about context. You're providing information that isn't necessarily super scientific, so it's not technical information, but it is relevant. So things like the demographics that are impacted, socioeconomic status of the region, any other relevant factors, political factors. All this information can be introduced here, can be explained here, and again, it can be discussed later in the discussion. So this introduction, this background is just for describing information, it's descriptive, and then the evaluation, the discussion happens in the distinct discussion session later, discussion section later, sorry. And this is highlighted again in the last sentence here, where we say that we can identify issues in the introduction. So if you're talking about the socioeconomic status of a particular region, if you're talking about political factors and government responses and things like that, it's absolutely fine to identify factors that impacted the outcome of the viral outbreak negatively. So, you know, limited resources and things like that, late government responses. You can identify these factors here. However, you want to fully discuss them later in the discussion. And when we do this, it gives the submission a nice sense of cohesiveness because you're linking the different sections. So it can be really good to make sure that factors that you discuss in the discussion are again introduced in the introduction. Okay, and also obviously don't forget even though we're talking about context and all these other things, you do need to have the crucial information on the virus itself, so on the causative agent. I mentioned the viral life cycle as an example of the key information you may need and probably will need. If you're talking about viral interventions that target the viral life cycle, it's difficult to understand them if you don't explain the viral life cycle. Let's think about any other aspects of the virus itself that are necessary to explain in the introduction. What about pathogenesis? How about a figure explaining pathogenesis? How about a figure explaining transmission? Really, really useful if we can include these. So again, the introduction is going to include a lot of context. It's also going to include a lot of technical information, and the idea is that all the information there should help the reader to understand the later parts of the submission. Okay, and that's the background and introduction. Now let's talk a little bit more about the timeline of events. Now the timeline of events, as we've said, it's a chronological timeline. It's a figure in which you define the key events in the viral outbreak, should be thoroughly referenced, should have a title, should have a legend, should have all these other components that we would expect of a high quality figure in a publishable submission, because that's what we're aiming for, isn't it? We're aiming to submit something that is of equal standard to published scientific literature. Don't feel limited to only including technical information about the outbreak again, so number of cases and the location and things like that. We also want to be including context, so government responses, you know, the inclusion of charity interventions, so we have WHO and things like that. So these big non-government organizations, they have an impact on things like this. When they intervene, when they do things, when they make suggestions, people listen. So we want to include things like that as well. It's important to note that this isn't really a critical section, so you're not expected to be significantly evaluative here. You don't necessarily have to evaluate information. You are just presenting the information here. It is a figure in which you outline the key events in the viral outbreak. And what you're then going to do in the discussion is be referring back to the timeline of events and evaluating the context and also the content of the timeline there. So the information is presented here in the timeline of events, and then in the discussion you're going to be referring back to your timeline of events and you're going to be evaluating parts of it. You're going to be evaluating government responses. You're going to be evaluating that new vaccine that was introduced on this particular date. You're going to be evaluating why cases increase so dramatically on a particular date or decrease so dramatically on a particular date. Again, you're going to be using your timeline of events as a resource to support your discussion. So as a resource to enable you to critically discuss the viral outbreak and the responses to the viral outbreak. Okay, and again, that's what the timeline of events is. So obviously, if we don't have a timeline of events, then our discussion is going to be really limited, because again, one of the purposes of the timeline of events is to support your discussion. It's to provide some kind of order and sense of progression to the reader's understanding of the outbreak that you can then work through. The background is similar in the sense that it's supporting your discussion in terms of the relevant underlying information. So if you don't have a sufficient background, then you're either going to be introducing concepts in the discussion that aren't explained, or you're going to be explaining background information in the discussion, and that's not good. That's not what a discussion is for. So yeah, background information in the background. Timeline of events is where you introduce this specific, clear, well-presented timeline of the viral outbreak in which you identify all the key events. And then the discussion is what we move on to now. So discussion, this is something you do have experience with, I know, in different submissions. Whether it's called the discussion or something else depends upon the submission. But what we're essentially talking about is a large body of text in which you critically evaluate. And what you are critically evaluating in this submission is largely going to be the interventions and actions and responses to the viral outbreak. So a lot of what you will be including on your timeline of events will be, as we said, the development of a new therapeutic intervention, the introduction of quarantine, the introduction of travel restrictions, the introduction of other measures like the burning of bodies, if we're thinking about Ebola and things like that. These are all things you can evaluate. This is where you evaluate them here. Again, that's what the discussion is for. Let's think about these responses and let's think, were they appropriate? Were they effective? Were they cost effective? Were they timely? Were they well considered? Were appropriate preparations in place? So was it too late to make these decisions, or could things have gone differently if there were specific preparations made in advance? What you're essentially doing is looking at the viral outbreak in hindsight. So with the benefit of hindsight, you're looking at everything that's been done and you're evaluating whether the decisions made were correct, whether the actions taken were effective. And you're going to be doing this not just looking back in hindsight, but also looking forward towards future viral outbreaks, because you're also going to be saying, what could be done differently next time? How could we learn from any mistakes? How can we learn from any successes? Okay, so this should be your approach. This is what the discussion is essentially for. You're also going to be discussing the specific therapeutic interventions, if there are any. So if it is the case that, a particular vaccine was introduced or a particular drug was introduced, then you need to go through the literature and you need to really, really understand and really, really explore whether or not this particular intervention was effective. And if it was effective, you need to make that clear. And if it wasn't effective, you need to make that clear as well. And then you need to lay out a particular path towards future development of interventions or the future use of this particular intervention. So we're at level 6 now. It's nowhere near enough to say, okay, this therapeutic intervention was introduced on this date and it looked like it worked because cases went down, or it looked like it worked because this one paper I found said it worked. It's just not enough, is it? It's just not even close to enough. At level 6, you need to be looking at all the different literature you can find and really looking in depth at the information there and critically evaluating that information. And it will be a case that not all the papers agree with each other, and that's absolutely fine. That's absolutely fine. You just need to explain that. You need to use the different papers, try and identify a consistent pattern. You need to be comfortable presenting different sides of a story. So presenting some papers that maybe say an intervention was effective and some papers that say the intervention was less effective, and presenting that objectively. Okay, so again, that's the purpose of the discussion. That's what you're going to be doing there. One thing students sometimes struggle with is this idea of evaluating the pathogen itself, and it is a tricky one. So evaluating pathogenesis, evaluating any other aspects of the pathogen itself. But all you're really needing to do for this is, sorry, I say all, it is tricky, it is difficult, but what you're needing to do for this is, again, look at the literature, but look at the literature that is relating to the pathogen itself. Look at the papers discussing virulence. Look at the papers discussing mutagenesis. Okay, look at these papers discussing how well the virus is transmitted by different routes, and you can evaluate these things. You can discuss what the papers say. You can discuss the strengths and weaknesses of the papers. Again, you can discuss the contrasting papers if there are any. And this is really how you're going to be evaluating information directly relevant to the pathogen itself, rather than a little bit wider where you're looking at the outbreak as a whole. Okay, and finally, don't neglect to discuss ethical issues. So students sometimes feel a little bit uncomfortable approaching ethical issues because it can be a bit of a tricky subject, right? And it's a lot less black and white than other areas of science maybe, but there's a necessity to discuss ethics sometimes, and there's really no need to shy away from it because it's important. So if there are ethical issues with the responses to your particular to the particular viral outbreak that you've chosen, please do discuss them. If we're talking about government interventions, then a lot of the time we're talking about interventions that impact a lot of different people that may or may not have consented, so there's ethical issues there, and it's worth discussing. If we're talking about vaccination, then there's ethical issues there around how do we increase compliance. So how do we get as many people as possible vaccinated, which is our scientific goal, whilst also respecting the fact that individuals have their own personal right to a decision about whether or not they are vaccinated. And it's a balance, isn't it? And usually there's a bit of coercion there, and you can discuss the ethics of this coercion, whether it went too far or it didn't go far enough. Even things like, is it ethical to not allow people who are not vaccinated to use certain businesses and things like that. It's worth discussing these things. They can be really interesting, and you can demonstrate your ability to understand a particular area critically and to discuss with an evaluative mind. So it's a good opportunity for you to demonstrate your ability to do these things. Okay. Okay, so hopefully we now see that the critical evaluation, the critical analysis largely belongs in the discussion. Now there's a consequence of this, which is that a lot of submissions are sometimes limited by the quality of the discussion. So if we're thinking about submissions that are good, they're strong submissions, but they're not pushing into the top boundary, a lot of the time that's because the discussion is limited in terms of evaluation, in terms of the inclusion of future research and future perspectives and these other critical ideas. So really do think about the discussion. So there's a lot of submissions each year where the abstract is strong, the introduction is strong, the timeline of events is strong, and the discussion is okay, but it's just lacking sufficient evaluation, and this limits the impact of the submission overall, because this evaluation is such a crucial part of it. It's such a really important part. And again, it's coming down to this discussion. And when you are including the evaluation in the discussion, you're demonstrating so many different things. You're demonstrating your ability to understand these complex concepts. You're demonstrating your ability to think critically. You're demonstrating your ability to come up with insightful ideas, particularly when you're making specific suggestions for future research based upon your evaluation. So the discussion can essentially be really, really strong where all these things are included and they're really valuable. Or on the other hand, if these things are missing, then the discussion can just be quite weak, and unfortunately it can limit the paper overall. So really do please make the effort to include evaluation and include critical analysis. I mentioned future studies there. This is something that should definitely be included as well, and it's kind of part of evaluation. So when you've evaluated a point, when you've evaluated a study, when you've discussed a problem, you then need to go on and suggest future perspectives. So what can be done about this problem in the future? Often this will come in the form of suggesting future research studies that can be done. This is great. However, you need to remember these suggestions should be specific, they should be reasonable, they should be based upon the literature, they should be achievable. These are all things that you should be bearing in mind when you're coming up with your suggestions for future research. We see too often really just a tag-on sentence at the end. So there'll be evaluation and this tag-on sentence, future research is needed or further research should be done. And I appreciate that when students include that, they're trying to include suggestions for future research, but there's no real value there because there's no substance. Anyone actually wishing to progress this research and actually reading the paper, looking for ideas for future research, is not really getting anything from that. They're just getting, again, this tag-on sentence, further research is needed. So what we actually want to be doing is building upon that and saying further research is needed to understand this specific thing, or to demonstrate this specific, whatever, to do something specific, and then there needs to be a suggestion as to what this study would actually look like. Okay, so you've evaluated a point, you've identified these issues and you've discussed them, and then you can say that you need to do future research to further elaborate on a point, or future research to better understand this particular fact. And then you need to hopefully, if you feel comfortable doing this, give examples of what this research would look like, being as detailed as you can. And hopefully you can see how that is much further than just saying future research is needed, and there's much more value there. Okay, and so now back to the key sections we need, and now we're finishing up on the conclusion. Okay, conclusion. So the conclusion is essentially a concise summary of the points made in your discussion. So the abstract is a summary of everything overall, so of the whole paper. The conclusion is a summary of your discussion. Okay, you're essentially putting together the key concluding statements, so the key concluding points that you've made in the discussion, and you're also hopefully including a summary of the future perspective you've put in, so the ideas for future research. Some students will have the conclusion, and before the conclusion we'll have a small section where they conclude the future studies specifically. So they have their discussion, then there's a little paragraph in which they summarize the key future perspectives they've put forth, and then they have the conclusion. This is absolutely fine as well, you can do that, that's not a problem. Be clear, be specific, be accurate. Yeah, so this is really crucial in the conclusion, and we should add be concise as well. So the conclusion is really one of the easiest parts, as long as you understand what a conclusion should be. And again, a conclusion is just a summary of the discussion. So the key points you've made should be summarized here. It shouldn't be a really lengthy conclusion. Because again, we want it to be concise. But if the conclusion, again, concisely summarizes the key points made in the discussion, then this is exactly what we want. Okay, thanks for listening everyone, hope you found it useful. It's going to be more support on the module space, but I think this video gives you a lot of really good information that should help you feel well supported as you put this submission together. Okay, thank you.